观众朋友们好，欢迎您来到今天的华尔街论坛节目现场，我是主持人 Lizzi 李琦。在今天的节目中我们首先为大家关注到的是时政方面的一条消息。新华社在周日刊发了中共中央办公厅关于加强新时代离退休干部党的建设工作的意见，其中呢有几句措辞引起了外界很大关注，说要确保离退休干部，特别是担任过领导职位的党员，继续听党话，跟党走，自觉在政治和行动上同以习近平为核心的党中央保持高度一致。接着又提到不得妄议党中央大政方针，不得传播政治性负面言论，不得参与非法社会组织活动。其中又特别指出，离退休的党员干部如果要出境，必须严格按照有关规定办理手续。文件中还有这样的说法，说针对近年来出现的个别党员干部退休后放松自我要求，发生违纪违法问题的新情况要做出指示。这样的说法是不是具体指向某人呢？让人想到此前《华尔街日报》曾经提出朱镕基对于习近平经济政策的不满意，也让人想到之前网球运动员彭帅在个人微博上曝光有关于张高丽对于他实施性侵的有关情况。尽管从具体文件的措辞来看，到底指向哪一位退休党员退休后放松自我要求，似乎并不十分清晰。这样的说法呢，还是引起了很大的关注，特别是老干部或者是离退休党员干部，在中国的政治生态中是十分特别的一处存在。此前我们的华尔街网报节目中也为大家介绍，中国前驻乌克兰大使高玉生在一个内部论坛上发表讲话，对于俄乌战争表达的观点与中国的官方口径十分不一致。是不是有的党员干部在背后妄议中央，导致20大前的政治安全环境不稳定呢？在今天稍后华尔街电视的华尔街焦点节目中，我的同事小杨会为大家进行更多的介绍。说完了这条时政有关的消息，今天我们最要为大家关注到的还是近期中国经济的走向。我们看到国家统计局在周一发布报告，显示4月份的消费者支出以及工厂的产出都出现了大幅下滑。此前中国政府一直释放信息，希望通过基建投资来支撑今年的增长，但是从数据中看到的情况却是基础建设投资增长大幅放缓。与此同时，更让人忧心的是总体失业率飙升至2年高点。在这样的负面数据的刺激下，在周一，花旗集团已把第二季度 GDP 同比增长的预期从 4.7% 下调至了 1.7%， 而把全年的 GDP 预期也从 5.1% 下调至 4.2%。如果我们看到最新的经济数据，受到冲击最大的是消费者支出。4月份的零售额比去年同期已经下降 11.1%， 这已经是连续第2个月出现下降了。而上海汽车销售协会在周一发表通告表示，全市范围内的封锁也意味着上海整个月没有一辆汽车被售出。这样的数据立即引起了外界媒体的注意。来自《华尔街日报》的报道还特别注意到，制造业也不景气，同时对于中国商品的海外需求不断疲软，产量下降，供应链中断，整个制造业前景也不妙。4月份的工业生产比上年同期下降 2.1%，特别是汽车行业的产量暴跌达到 43.5%。 再来看到城市失业率，4月份连续第2个月已经超过了 5.5个百分点的官方目标值，攀升至 6.1%， 这也是2020年2月出现 6.2% 这样的失业率以来的最高值。特别值得关注的是16到24岁所谓的青年失业率已经达到 18.2%，这是整个大流行病期间以及之后最高水平。统计局发言人在发布会上也表示，经济所面临的挑战超出了预期。涉及中国的经济数字，大家也很清楚，如果最终中国解除封锁，经济活动是会回升的。但是现在中国政府所面临的严峻问题就是能不能通过货币和财政工具来软化这一打击对于中国经济的下行压力。我们也知道，从2020年以来，中国面对疫情的刺激措施一直是集中在供给方面，在需求端给力可以说十分不足。此前华尔街网报也为您介绍，有一些顶级的中国经济学家以及中国政府智囊学者在周六在北京的一个论坛上发言， 大家普遍达成一致的意见就是必须要采取更加积极的政策来对现在的经济下行压力进行反向的助推。北京大学的经济学教授，也是前人民银行的顾问黄一平，甚至在会上表示，我们已经到了应该不惜一切代价使用政策手段来拯救经济的地步。来自澳新银行的分析则表示，中国经济现在主要有2个挑战，首先是货币宽松的空间正在缩小，企业消费情绪正在恶化。现在这一次奥密克戎变种的传播性更高，如果像2020年武汉封锁之后期望于快速反弹，几乎是不可能的状况。来自《华尔街日报》的报道还介绍到，由于现在经济状况不断恶化，外界普遍预期央行是不是要在周一降低贷款利率，但是后来却没有实现。现在呢，货币政策宽松空间的确是比较有限了，因为美联储不断加息。如果中国在加息环境下再度降息，更会加剧对于中国资本外流的担忧。那么央行做了什么呢？在周日，我们看到银行降低了首次购房者的抵押贷款利率，这显然是为了支撑不断下行的房地产行业。而根据我们看到周一公布的官方数据显示，在4月的时候，新屋开工以及房屋销售的价值比去年同期分别下降了 44% 和 47%， 这个数字比3月的下滑还要严重。现在中国政府面临的更大的挑战是什么呢？我们也很清楚，就是需求端的刺激。我们看到4月份企业的中长期贷款增长比3月已经出现了大幅放缓，投资的欲望不断减弱，而家庭的贷款总额也下降了 1.7%， 也反映对于新的抵押贷款和消费债的需求都有所缩减。那么为什么中国的政策制定者从大流行病开始以来一直没有向家庭发放现金，或者是加强失业福利呢？现在又是不是已经到了应该发现金的时候呢？中国政府此前的态度一直是向企业提供更加廉价的贷款，向公司和企业主提供超过 2.5 万亿人民币的退税刺激。但是这样在供给端的效果几乎没有办法对于经济起到深度的刺激措施，特别是如果企业的利润和增长都受到很大的影响，从减税中受益的幅度恐怕也不大。这是近期中国经济所面临的困难。那么从中长期来看，中国经济还有哪些挑战呢？在今天的华尔街论坛节目中，我们特别要为您介绍到的是北京大学的经济学教授迈克尔·帕蒂斯教授，他此前所发表的一篇文章。他提出中国经济实现转型只有5条出路。他到底是怎么讲的呢？他首先提出的一个观点是，如果从能否实现某个 GDP 的目标的角度来看待中国经济，这将是一个错误。为什么呢？帕蒂斯教授分析，中国的 GDP 增长并不像其他的主要经济体的统计数字那样是对国家的经济产出和绩效的衡量。相反，中国的 GDP 增长目标是北京政府在年初的一项投入，它是否能够实现，主要取决于中国当局在多大程度上愿意利用国家的资源和债务能力来实现所需的经济活动量。这就意味着，对于中国而言， GDP 增长较快并不意味着比 GDP 增长较慢对于整个经济的发展是更好的结果。相反，它只是意味着北京当局更愿意利用资源来创造经济活动。但是需要打上问号的是，这种活动是不是有成效，是不是可持续？帕蒂斯教授提出的一个观点是，系统的投入并不能说明系统的性能到底是好是坏。那么经济增长到底从何而来呢？说白了，就是消费、出口和商业投资。好的经济增长是可持续的，另外的不好的增长就是膨胀增长。帕蒂斯教授认为，对于中国而言，膨胀增长主要意味着对于基础设施和房地产的非生产性投资。那么到底应该如何衡量中国 GDP 中的浪费问题呢？这显然是一个比较棘手的问题。而帕蒂斯教授提出的一个指标就是中国债务。那我们知道，中国债务中有不成比例的份额被用于投资，而这些投资中呢，有相当一部分可能是并不符合性价比的。因此，帕蒂斯教授提出了一种想法，就是用中国的债务与 GDP 之比来衡量 GDP 数字中所谓膨胀增长量的比例。他举了2个例子。 在2020年的时候，当时大流行冲击中国经济，导致消费崩溃、增长萎缩，而中国 GDP 有相当大的一部分是由基础设施和房地产投资激增所带来的。因此，中国官方的债务与 GDP 比例在这一年也从大概247%上升到了270%。到了2021年，中国的疫情形势有了很大的好转，出口出现激增。与此同时，北京又打击房地产行业，限制了基础设施投资的浪费性增长。结果就是当年的债务与 GDP 之比并没有出现广泛的上升。那么，如果我们认为投资有广泛的生产性，可以创造直接和间接的经济价值，那么在短期到中期内，债务的增长会被国内生产总值的增长相匹配，这样国家的债务与 GDP 的比例就不会上升。相反，如果债务不断上升，而 GDP 却没有跟上，显示的就是这一些投资所创造的价值是浪费的，并不是很好的用于良性的经济运转。帕蒂斯教授说，大概从70年代末到2000年中期，中国的债务虽然是急剧上升，但是 GDP 也很快跟上。这说明中国尽管有很高的投资比例，但是这种投资呢，对于整个经济运转还基本处于良性。但是在2006年到2008年的时候，这一对关系就发生了变化，债务不断加速，而 GDP 的增长却出现了减速。而同时，帕蒂斯教授认为有2种投资我们必须分开。首先是私营企业的投资，这些活动呢往往是生产性的，如果企业进行的投资是非生产性的浪费投资，最终呢会导致企业破产，也就是有这样的一个天然的优胜劣汰的过程。但是与之相反的是，没有硬预算约束的实体的投资，比如地方政府和国企的投资，这样的一部分投资没有办法很快转换成优势生产资源，但是又没有一个天然的市场的优胜劣汰的机制，把地方政府和国企淘汰掉，就导致这一部分投资造成了很大的臃肿和浪费。在2000年到2010年期间，中国的银行体系清出了大量的不良贷款，显示中国经济体一直就有大量浪费投资。但是中国的高投资水平在整体上仍然是良性的、生产性的，也为中国经济带来了快速可持续的 GDP 增长。但是就如帕蒂斯教授所说，到了2006年到2008年这个拐点上，中国就像其他类似高储蓄、高投资增长模式的国家一样，遭遇了债务逆风。还有哪些历史先例可供借鉴呢？就是20世纪50年代和60年代的苏联和巴西，以及70年代和80年代的日本。在这样的一个阶段，中国就像这些国家一样，债务负担迅速上升。那么中国到底怎样走出现在不健康、不持续的经济发展模式呢？帕蒂斯教授提出了5条道路。首先，系统性的投资错配会产生持续高增长，但是这样的增长是不可持续的，因此国家如果有这样的畸形增长，就必须进行艰难的调整。广义上来讲，经济体只有3个需求源可以推动增长，就是消费、投资以及贸易盈余。因此，帕蒂斯教授给中国转型开出了5条道路。第一条道路是中国可以保持目前的这样的一条道路，就是继续让大量的非生产性投资推动国家债务无限期的上升。第二条道路是中国减少非生产性投资，而代之以新技术等生产性投资。第三条道路是中国减少非生产性投资，代之以消费。第四条道路是减少非生产性投资，代之以贸易顺差。而最后一条道路是减少非生产性投资，但是不管是消费、生产性投资还是贸易都没有跟上，而在这种情况下，增长必然会急剧放缓。那么中国到底会选择哪一条道路，又应该选择哪一条道路呢？帕蒂斯教授分析，除了第一条道路，也就是继续现在的增长模式之外，几乎每一条道路都意味着经济体制必须要出现重大变化，而这一些变化也不可避免的与政治体制的重大变化联系在一起。同时，帕蒂斯教授做出了一个比较悲观的预期，就是如果从历史状况来看，曾经遭遇和中国一样困境的国家，最后都走了这5条道路中的最后一条，也就是什么都不变，但是放弃非生产性投资，最后的结果是经济增长大 大幅放缓。目前中国每年的投资占到 GDP 的 40%到 45%， 这样的数字在整个世界国家范围内都是非常高的，其中大概有 30% 是被用于基础设施投资，另外有不到 30% 是被分配给了房地产投资。相比之下，分配到高科技部门的这一部分只占到 GDP 的不到 10%。 因此向原来的非生产性模式转向生产性模式，或者我们就是说偏向科技部门的投资，其实并不是一件容易的事情。帕蒂斯教授还分析，房地产和基础设施投资所带来的财富激增，也会围绕这一种投资方式形成社会、经济、金融以及政治体制。这样的一种投资错配也会导致家庭的房屋所有权在总储蓄中占到不成比例的高份额，达到 70% 甚至以上。而如果一个国家的投资过程发生彻底转变，这一些随之的社会、经济、金融、家庭结构的转变也是必要而来的。而这样的转变就会要求在政治方式上也进行转变。因此如果从历史经验上来看，这样做是非常困难的。因此用生产性投资来取代非生产性投资，虽然听着容易，可能做起来并没有那么容易。那么中国能不能用消费增长来取代非生产性投资呢？首先来看一组数据，截止2020年，中国的家庭消费占到中国 GDP 比例不到 40%， 而其他国家的全球平均比值大概是 60%。那么少的这一部分是分配给哪些部门呢？那我们也知道，在整个经济体中，所谓 GDP 的分配无非就是3个部门：家庭、企业以及政府。而中国的企业在 GDP 份额中的保留份额与其他的相应国家大概是成比的。也就是说，中国如果重新平衡消费，唯一的途径就是要从地方政府向家庭进行转移。把 GDP 的10个百分点到20个百分点从地方政府转移到家庭，不仅是经济方式的转变，也是政治权力的重大转变。因此中国是不是有这样的决心来进行政治以及经济结构相应的重大转变呢？这样的政治意愿又在哪里呢？帕蒂斯教授在这里也打上了一个问号。再看第4条途径，中国是不是能够用贸易顺差来取代非生产性投资呢？截止到去年年底，中国的贸易顺差大概占到了中国 GDP 的 4%到 5%。 如果靠出口来带动 GDP 转型，对于较小的对外性的经济体来说可能是可行的策略，但是对于中国这样一个大型经济体来说，贸易顺差本来就已经足够高了，而世界其他国家可能也不会接受中国继续扩大贸易顺差。之后就说到了第5种可能，如果中国不用其他的增长来取代非生产性投资，会出现怎样的后果呢？帕蒂斯教授分析，这必然会导致中国 GDP 的大幅收缩。如果他的计算是正确的，中国未来多年的 GDP 增长上限可能是 2% 到 3%。 那么这样急剧的 GDP 增长放缓会以什么样的方式实现呢？帕蒂斯教授分析，总共有2种可能。第一种方式就是巨变，通常是会以金融危机的形式出现，国内生产总值急剧收缩。另外一种呢，就是像日本那样，可能是几十年的低迷，几十年的非常低的增长，来实现这样的经济发展转型。那么中国的经济到底是会以金融危机硬着陆的方式进行调整，还是会以几十年的低迷增长的形式进行调整呢？帕蒂斯教授认为，答案可能主要取决于中国国内资产负债表和金融系统的稳定性，以及中国金融当局控制和重组系统性负债的能力。在帕蒂斯教授看来，中国国内的金融条件使得中国不大可能发生真正的金融危机，或者是经济的急剧萎缩和硬着陆。而在他看来，中国更有可能面临的是很长的日本式的低增长时期。而在这一篇论文的最后，帕蒂斯教授写道，无论中国政府做出如何的决定，中国或多或少都会被迫从第1条道路转向其他4条道路中的1条。而历史告诉我们，中国政府做出这样决定的时间越长，最终的调整就可能在经济上越困难，在政治上造成更大的混乱。 在本期的华尔街论坛节目中，我们为大家分析了近期中国经济所遭遇的逆风，主要是由疫情封锁所造成的。但是这样的一次经济逆风却给中国的货币政策制定方带来了前所未有的麻烦。一方面是国际形势，一方面是国内需求不振，到底应该怎么调整？而比起近期的逆风，长期面对中国经济更严重的问题可能是经济增长方式的调整。在这里呢，我们为大家介绍的是北京大学的经济学教授帕蒂斯对于中国中长期经济出路的5个可能性的分析，希望这样内容对你有所帮助。而在本期节目的最后，我们再来关注到的是近期国际局势的相关消息。说及俄乌战争，在今天上午刚刚有消息传出，瑞典和芬兰可能正式要开启加入北约的申请进程。如果说普京发动战争的目的之一是削弱北约，那么从这样的结果来看，可能适得其反。现在西方对于俄罗斯实施了一系列经济制裁，这样的经济制裁是否达到了效果呢？长远来讲，对于整个国际金融局势会造成什么样的影响呢？美元的霸主地位是不是可能因此衰弱甚至解体呢？如果类似的经济制裁用在中国身上，又会对全球经济造成什么样的打击？制裁有可能会阻挡住北京武统的步伐和意愿吗？在刚刚过去的这一周里呢，我采访到了 CSIS 一位资深的研究员，他曾经是中央情报局以及美国国家情报局在亚洲以及东亚经济分析的专业人士。他对于制裁又是什么样的看法？他对中国是否可能武统台湾的可能性又做出了什么样的分析呢？在本期节目最后，我们为您带来这一段专访。Sanctions imposed by the West on Russia have potential long-term effects on its economy. What does that mean for future Western economic threats aimed at China, which is a far more important economy? Will they deter China from assisting Russia or from following through with Taiwan threats? Joining me today is Gerard de Pippo, Senior Fellow in the Economics Program at CSIS, who previously spent 11 years in the U.S. government as an economic analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency and National Intelligence Council. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Gerard, I want to start with the Russian sanctions. In the recent commentary, you argue that the sanctions targeting Russia have 3 goals: to deter, to destabilize, and to degrade. Can you elaborate further on the 3D frameworks? Have the Western sanctions been successful according to your framework?
Sure. So I tried to break down the goals of the Western sanctions aimed against Russia more or less in a chronological order. So as you said, that those 3 goals were to deter, to destabilize, and to degrade. So the first one, to deter, was, as it sounds, to prevent Russia from attacking or invading Ukraine. That failed, obviously. We can talk about why, but that failed. The second goal was to destabilize, mostly to destabilize the Russian financial sector. That was the big tool there was the sanctions against the Russian central bank that effectively froze most of their foreign exchange reserves. Basically, all the reserves that were not in Chinese renminbi, essentially, or gold, were frozen because the G7 plus, the ECB, Japan, UK, Korea, even Switzerland, everyone basically ganged up on the Russian central bank and froze their assets, so they couldn't actually intervene in markets. And that meant that for a little while, at least, the Russian ruble collapsed. Now, it has since rebounded. In fact, today it's actually above its exchange rate that it was before the war started. That's misleading, though, because the Russians have put in capital controls. So the Russian ruble is no longer a convertible currency. But there has been a fair degree of stabilization in the Russian financial sector. And that is mostly because, even allowed by the sanctions, the Russian government continues to export energy and other commodities like metals and wheat, but it's most importantly about energy. And that allows them to earn hard currency, which helps stabilize their exchange rate and helps stabilize their financial sector. So for now, that has the destabilization goal has not appeared to succeed. The third goal is to degrade the Russian economy. This is slower acting. This relies mostly on export controls, which initially were focused on military or dual-use technologies. Over time, that has expanded to include a lot of other industrial inputs and capital goods, so things that factories might need or certain sectors might need, like tractors and some other things, to keep up production and to keep the economy moving. This is slower acting because in many cases, companies or factories will have inventories of those goods. Over time, they'll run out of spare parts, essentially, and that weakens the Russian economy. The goal there, basically, is not only to degrade the Russian economy, but it's really to degrade Russia's ability to continue its war effort. So we've seen anecdotal evidence of Russian factories that produce military tanks having to suspend production. There's also some evidence that Russia's running out of some precision munitions because they don't have all the high-tech components to keep making those weapons. And so the third goal of degrading is working, albeit slowly.
Right. Russia's invasion has spurred many talks in Beijing. I wonder if you can help us understand what equivalent sanctions would be for China and how their potential impact compares with the Russian sanctions we've seen so far.
If truly equivalent sanctions were levied against China, it would be probably catastrophic for the global economy because the Chinese economy is so much bigger than Russia's economy. So compared to last year, so before the war started, before all the sanctions on Russia was the 11th largest economy in the world. China was the second largest. So China's economy is 10 times the size of Russia's. China's banking sector is huge. It's actually the largest in the world, and it's about 30 times as big as the Russian banking sector. Or if you look at, say, the amount of foreign investment in Russia or China, that includes foreign direct investment, but also buying things like stocks and bonds, the amount of foreign exposure in China is at least 6 times larger than it was in Russia before the war. On top of that, you have China is by far the world's leading manufacturing power. It's the number one exporter of manufactured goods. It's essentially the world's factory. It doesn't necessarily make all the high value added goods. It makes a lot of intermediate things. It does a lot of assembly, but that is a central node in global supply chains. So hypothetically, if equivalent sanctions were imposed, such as sanctioning or freezing the assets of the People's Bank of China overseas, so that China's $3.2 trillion in foreign exchange reserves, if the West were to kick major Chinese banks off the SWIFT messaging network, and some other sanctions that would basically prohibit Western entities from interacting with Chinese banks or certain Chinese entities. If you literally duplicated the sanctions against Russia and put that on China, it would be catastrophic. For China, so although obviously China is much larger economically, it's more powerful economically in many ways compared to Russia. But the fact is that China is still mostly reliant on the US dollar for international finance. So only about 15% of China's goods trade, so goods that are on ships and planes, only about 15% of that is paid for in RMB across borders. The vast majority is paid in dollars. So basically, it's very difficult for China to avoid that. And I'm not saying that the West would do the same sanctions, but if they did, it would be massively disruptive.
I see. And we see media reports that Beijing is clearly worried about similar sanctions imposed on itself. Beijing has ordered a comprehensive set of stress tests to examine the potential economic implications of similar actions if imposed on China. So what leverage does China have against the West? What are some potential ways for China to retaliate in the future?
Well, regarding the stress tests, it's, as I was saying, it's actually very difficult, at least in the short to medium term, for China to mitigate its exposure, particularly to the dollar, because it's so reliant on that. So I saw press reports saying the same thing. They called in foreign banks and basically said, what can you do to reduce risk? And the foreign bankers said, we don't actually know because there's nothing they can do. So in that sense, China's in a tough spot. But because China is so important economically, it does have other tools. If you were to break down the 3 core types of sanctions the West is using, would be financial sanctions. Those are mostly on banks. Then there are export controls, and then there are restrictions on imports. So basically, the U.S. saying we're not going to buy Russian oil at the import restriction. If you flip that and said, okay, what does China have in that regard? China, in theory, could use export controls. It is, as I said, the number one manufacturer. So it could say, the world, you basically don't get most of your laptops, most of your cell phones. They could also do things like restricting core inputs like rare earth elements, which China is the number one processor of. And that would have a lot of downstream effects where a lot of other goods that might be made elsewhere could not be produced because you need those components. You can only get them from China. China has been working on setting up a legal regulatory regime to counter sanctions and also to apply sanctions and export controls over the past 2 or 3 years. They haven't actually really used it, but the framework exists. So they're trying to formalize some of their mechanisms. But the other big thing that China has is its own domestic market. This is in general, even just apart from sanctions. It's maybe its biggest point of leverage with Western companies and Western governments. So, for example, U.S. multinationals that own companies with operations in China, so basically their subsidiaries, the revenues that those companies make in China are bigger than all of U.S. exports to China. So the activity of foreign firms in China is actually often bigger than literal trade. And those foreign firms in China are, of course, exposed to the Chinese market. And in theory, the Chinese government could disrupt their operations. They could organize boycotts. They could tell them they have to stop producing. They could give contracts to competitors, et cetera. So China does have a lot of economic leverage. The area where China is really lacking would be in the financial domain. Yes, China in theory could impose financial sanctions on Western banks or on Western entities, but because of the very limited reach of the Chinese currency and their reliance on the dollar internationally, it wouldn't really mean very much. And so those would be mostly domestically oriented financial sanctions. Internationally, China just doesn't have the same length and reach that the U.S. dollar sanctions could have.
Finally, I wanted to turn to China's top one red line issue, the Taiwan issue. Tell me, how does the strategic environment of Taiwan differ from that of Ukraine? Does your 3D framework still apply in a Taiwan scenario?
So strategically, the obvious and very important difference is that Taiwan is an island. Ukraine is not only not an island, but it is connected to essentially NATO countries who are able to resupply it. So Ukraine is keeping up the fight, yes, with its own competent military and heroism, but the Ukrainian military is able to resist and counterattack against Russia because they're getting a steady flow of Western weapons. So that might be like the Javelin missile you probably heard about. A lot of other things. They're getting tanks now from Central European governments. They're getting some spare parts. They're getting plenty of ammunition, etc. And so that is allowing them to keep up the fight. Now, hypothetically, in the case of a Chinese attack on Taiwan, it might be very difficult or even impossible to resupply Taiwan because the People's Liberation Army, their Navy, would probably at a minimum attempt some type of blockade. So even if they're not trying to literally invade Taiwan, it would make it very difficult to get supplies through to Taiwan, which means that in that scenario, essentially whatever Taiwan has at the start of the conflict in terms of material, weapons, training, etc., that's all they're going to get. And if you try to have the similar analogy with the Ukraine crisis, in Ukraine, as I was saying, they're being resupplied constantly. Taiwan would not be. Now, that would mean that the two latter goals of the sanctions, the destabilization and degrading, would be far less viable against China in a practical sense in this scenario, because basically, one, China's much bigger, but two, you wouldn't have much hope of degrading the Chinese economy at least quick enough to end that war. So you basically would have to assume that the Taiwan military could hold out for a very long time on its own. That's probably a big assumption. Or you'd have to assume that using those sanctions or the threat of those sanctions after the war began would be sufficient to get the Chinese leadership, Xi Jinping or others, to pull back in an operation. I think that is extremely unlikely. I think once Xi Jinping or whoever's in charge of China, if and when this happens, decides to go, if they roll the dice, they're going to go in. And that means that really you're only left with deterrence, which is the first goal of the sanctions that were used against Russia. And as I said, that was the goal that failed, which means it's worth examining why it failed and learning from those lessons. One thing is that before the Russian invasion, the United States and other governments, they did threaten sanctions in the event of an invasion. But what they threatened was actually less than or weaker than they ended up doing in the real world. In other words, they underwarned.
Right.
They suggested that the punishment would be lighter than it ended up being. Why did that happen? Because from the perspective of deterrence, it actually makes no sense. The logic should be reversed. You want to scare your adversary, prevent them from attacking. I think what happened, there's a few things. One, apart from the United States and the British government, most Western countries didn't seem to believe that Russia would actually attack because it seemed so insane, but they did. The U.S. was warning very clearly about intelligence, but even our European allies And even to some extent, Ukraine itself didn't seem to want to believe that. Two, it's hard to know how any political class set of voters or any population in general will respond to a shock until it happens. And so before the war started, it might have been that the European governments who didn't really believe the war was going to happen anyway thought, well, if it does, it will be fast and the Ukrainians will lose, Russia will win, and that will be the end of it, and it will be hopeless. And in fact, from what we can tell publicly, the U.S. predictions were that the Russians were going to win the war fairly quickly, which was not the case. So in a world where, say, Ukraine fell quickly, maybe there wouldn't be as big sanctions because it would be seen as hopeless. Mm-hmm. But in the real world, they resisted. And that caused an upswell of sympathy in Europe and elsewhere for the Ukrainian cause. And I think it probably caught their own leaders in Europe by surprise. And that basically gave them the political impulse to go hard on sanctions. And so what I'm trying to say, practically speaking, for future scenarios is it's very important, even though it's difficult, for the U.S. and its allies to discuss in advance certain contingencies, even things that are very improbable, things that they want to think are unthinkable, that they don't want to happen, but to talk about those things frankly and establish red lines early. So internally agree, these are the things we would consider warning indicators, these are the things that we think would be unacceptable. Once those things are agreed upon, or the extent they can be agreed upon, in the real world, if those things start happening, it is incumbent on the U.S. and other governments to be very clear about those threats and saying, if you do X, Y, and Z, we will retaliate in this way, this way, and this way. If that actually happens, if those red lines are crossed, then the U.S. and its allies would actually have to implement those sanctions. And my view is most likely in a China-Taiwan scenario, they would actually have to go pretty hard, pretty early, meaning doing aggressive sanctions before the actual war starts. Because, as I said, I suspect if a war happens, the Chinese government's going to be fully committed. They're not going to pull back because they would expect at least some sanctions. And so basically, it's a call for planning and taking seriously these threats. And then finally, putting it also into the context of Ukraine, recognizing that economic sanctions are really, at best, a supplement to military action once wars start. And so basically, I would caution any policymaker from assuming that economic sanctions are a replacement for credible military deterrence. I think you need both. And if you only have one, the other one might not work.
From multiple media reports, we see Saudi Arabia has initiated talks with China about pricing oil shipment in RMB. India has proposed to pay for oil imports from Russia in rupees. And there seems to be this loosening of the dollar's stranglehold on trade and reserve holdings in the globe. Is there any reason to believe the dollar's dominance or role as a transnational political weapon is waning in the aftermath of the war? What does a post-dollar hegemony world look like? And I have to ask this, do you see crypto as a potential tool to evade sanctions in the future?
So there's a lot there. We'll break that down.
Sure.
The dollar is the world's leading international currency by various metrics. So that would be share of official reserves. It would be how much it's used as a transactional currency. It would be how it's used for invoicing. It would be how often it is used by other offshore entities to issue debt. So, for example, if emerging markets want to issue foreign debt, they typically do it in dollars, sometimes in euros, but mostly in dollars. All those metrics, the dollar is quite dominant, at least highly competitive, if not extremely dominant. There has been a long-standing discussion, really going back 50, 60 years, actually, of various ways or times when the dollar's dominance might be perceived as slipping. This actually goes back to the 1960s. It goes back to when Nixon went off the gold standard. It also then occurred in the 1970s during the oil shocks when there was a lot of inflation. You saw it in the 2000s when the U.S. was running massive current account deficits. You're seeing it now in the context of the sanctions. In all those cases, the predictions of the dollar's demise were at least premature. And it's because ultimately, when you're talking about an alternative, you need an alternative. So if not the dollar, then what? There are different scenarios there, but I think the key is to accept that in terms of the depth of its financial markets, the amount of assets denominated in that currency, its predictable legal structure, and at least its macroeconomic management relative to everyone else, the dollar really doesn't have any rivals. The only one that was sort of close was the euro maybe 15 years ago, and then it slipped back because they had their own debt crisis. You're right that India and China and others have talked about settling energy contracts in their domestic currency, so rupees or RMB. It is an important distinction, though, between the pricing of a commodity and the settlement of a commodity in a given currency. So oil is priced in dollars. Now, if you are selling the oil, we can agree to settle it in whatever currency we want. But the pricing, the global pricing, is still based in dollars, and there's no sign of that changing. Now, at the margins, if, say, China is paying Saudi Arabia for its oil in RMB, we're talking, tens of billions of dollars per year, maybe over a few years. That would be an RMB that would otherwise be in dollars. But the key issue is ultimately, for the RMB in particular, and the rupee is just way below that, it's not Chinese. The Chinese currency is not fully convertible. China has capital controls. You might hear economists say that a lot. The real issue there is there is not a lot of RMB assets outside of China, whether they be deposits, whether they be RMB-denominated bonds. And if you are, say, Saudi Arabia and you're accepting payment in RMB, you can really only use the RMB to buy stuff from China. Now, China has a lot to sell, so that's not a terrible proposition. But if you then want to buy something from Europe, from Japan, or whatever, you have to convert it probably back into dollars to make the transaction work. And so any erosion there is going to be gradual. And I think from the perspective of governments like, say, the Saudis or others who are considering getting away from the dollar system, part of that is geopolitical, right? It's that they're worried about the threat of sanctions. The U.S. does and can use sanctions. Most recently, in a multilateral sense, it would be very difficult to escape from. But there are only so many governments that are actually worried about those kinds of sanctions. And even then, they still have to rely mostly on dollars. So Saudi Real, for example, their currency is pegged to the dollar. There's really no technical way, as it stands now, that can be pegged to the RMB, just because there isn't enough outside of China to make that work. In terms of reserves, the dollar has been slightly eroding. It's about 59% of global reserves. The RMB is maybe 3%. This is IMF statistics. The big holders of reserves are actually oil exporters in the Asian economy. So China actually cannot hold RMB assets as reserves. So it actually kind of, it naturally limits how much can shift. But in general, you've seen sort of ups and downs over the last 50 years in the dollar's share. But the fact is that the dollar is overwhelmingly dominant. And that's because during crises or in general, most investors want to hold dollar assets. In fact, you're seeing it right now, this month, this week. There's all these bad things happening in the global economy, high inflation, even in the United States, high energy prices, a lot of uncertainty. There's the war and what's happening to the US dollar. The dollar is getting stronger. And it's because a lot of money is flowing in and actually money is flowing out of China. And it's because the dollar is ultimately a safe haven asset. And I don't see any plausible scenario in the medium term, at least, for that changing. You asked about crypto. Crypto is a whole other thing, but we'll just talk about it in the context of sanctions evasion. When the war started, there actually was a lot of talk about, could Russia use cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin to evade sanctions? The short answer is it's technically possible at small scale, but at a large scale, it's very difficult. And it's difficult because for three key reasons. One, cryptocurrencies are actually they're not anonymous. People call them anonymous, but they're not. In English, the word is pseudonymous, meaning that they're linked to a particular wallet or an entity. You may not know the name of the person who owns that, but they are linked to that, and there are forensics ways. There are companies that actually specialize in tracing which entity is getting payment. So it's actually hard to evade capture on the blockchain because everything on the blockchain is recorded. The second thing is the way the market is structured is mostly through centralized exchanges. Those centralized exchanges in basically all major jurisdictions, except for Russia and a few others, and cryptocurrencies are illegal in China at this point, they have what are called know your customer rules. So they are required by law to know who is holding those accounts and comply with anti-money laundering rules. And so it's actually very difficult to use those mechanisms and get away with evasion. There are things called decentralized exchanges, or also you can do direct transfers. Those are much, much smaller in terms of transactions, though. And the third issue is liquidity, which is that basically the cryptocurrency market trades in these, say, tens of millions of dollars per day typically. It might actually be lower now because values are falling so much. Russia, for example, before the war started, was importing something like $900 million worth of goods per day. Okay, so there was not nearly enough transactions out there in cryptocurrency to make that work. If we're talking China, it's going to be in the billions per day, right? And so there's no way there are enough cryptocurrency assets and trading out there to make that work.